Welcome to Fireside Chats with Erin, the reboot. I'm Erin Gowerluck, the president of the Canada Grains Council and your host. This podcast serves as a forum to explore grain sector priorities that reflect the Council's work here at home and around the world. Together, we will discuss issues and ideas with policymakers and industry influencers. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Lloyd Day, who has served as the Deputy Director General at the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture since 2012. Lloyd started his career with the Governor of California, eventually becoming the Assistant Secretary of International Trade and Investment for the state. Then he moved to Washington, D.C. to serve as the Administrator of the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Services and Head of Federal Government Affairs at Syngenta. Lloyd, thank you for stopping by for a fireside chat.
Thank you, Erin. It's nice to see you as always.
I understand Washington is no longer home. Is Costa Rica the home base now and the headquarters of IICA?
Correct.
And how is living in Costa Rica by comparison to living in Washington?
Well, the weather's a lot nicer, that's for sure. I've been here for 12 years now, so they call me a gringo tico since I've been.
I've never been. I have to go at some point. I will visit. So look, Lloyd, I've really been looking forward to this conversation, and I know that many of our listeners have too. But you have an impressive background. Your bio just skims the surface. So I was hoping that you could maybe take a deeper dive and talk a little bit more about how some of the work that you were doing, both with government at the state level and at the federal level, and with the private sector, has informed the work that you're doing today with IICA.
Well, thank you. It's been a long journey, and I don't want to say it's that long, but it is. It's been 3 decades of work. I started out with the state of California, working on international trade. A lot of the relationships that we have in the NAFTA countries happened back then in the 1990s. And so I was working very closely with the Secretary of Agriculture at the time, a lady named Dan Veneman, the Secretary of Agriculture for California. And then she became the Secretary of Agriculture for President Bush. She brought me to Washington, D.C., where I worked with her on international trade and eventually on agricultural marketing. And from that, the Bush administration went to work for a large agricultural input and science technology company. And that then the person who I had interacted with when I was at USDA on trade with Mexico became the Director General of IICA. And despite our trade sometimes disputes, we had a good working relationship. And he asked me to come down and join him here in IICA. And I jumped at the opportunity because of the important role IICA plays in working with all the ministers of agriculture of the hemisphere. And as someone who had been involved in international trade, it really appealed to me to go down and join him.
So let's talk a bit about IICA, because I have to admit, I was really only introduced to the organization a couple of years ago. Your colleague Jean-Charles here in Canada is a fixture at many of the agriculture events and conferences across the country. So he and I had an opportunity to sit down one day. So share that with our listeners, if you wouldn't mind. Let's talk a bit about how the organization is structured, who can be involved, and maybe the types of policy files that you're leading.
Sure, great. Well, our authorities are the Ministers of Agriculture, as the Secretary of Agriculture of the Western Hemisphere. So from Canada in the north down to Argentina in the south and 14 member states in the Caribbean. So their priorities are our priorities. Now, we're kind of like a mini Department of Agriculture for the entire hemisphere. So we work on a lot of the same things that Ministers of Agriculture work on, but we call them our program areas of technical cooperation. So we have offices in all 34 countries, and then we have about 9 technical cooperation areas, and they cover the big issues of agriculture. So SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary affairs are always going to be the huge issues that we talk to. And that moves into food safety as well, which we've really grown in our work on food safety with Canada's government, all the 34 member states, because food safety is so critical. And nutrition is becoming a more and more important component of all that. And then we have the challenges of the day, like climate change, like science and innovation and biotechnology. Since we work with a lot of developing countries, rural development and family agriculture are important components of what we do. So all these elements that are kind of a basket of any kind of Ministry of Agriculture has a home here with us. And so we try to focus on helping all of our member states engage in these kind of issues and develop the policies and the programs that they need to have so they can help their farmers and their constituents.
Thanks, Lloyd. I appreciate that introduction to the organization and the focus of the work that you are involved with. Now, let's pan out and talk about the agriculture industry more broadly, maybe across the Americas to begin. And I want to get into some of the international outreach that IICA does in other jurisdictions in just a moment. But you've been involved with this organization now for 12 years, and in the sector, to your point, now for almost 30 years. How have the issues evolved in your view? And what are some of the challenges that we're facing today that maybe weren't even on the agenda 10 years ago?
A lot of the issues are the same when it comes to productivity, when it comes to weather, when it comes to climate, when it comes to the pests and diseases that agriculturalists and farmers have to face. So those SPS issues, which are now front and center all over the place and growing, have always been there. The trade issues that have always been there. But today, I think there's a couple of elements that are really changing the way we think about agriculture, and that's the whole debate related to climate change. And I saw you at the COP28. Climate change is now front and center in everything we do. And now people talk about sustainability, and sustainability is kind of blended into climate change. And how do we grow and produce more, but have a lesser impact on the land? And how do we produce for 50 billion people or 10 billion people by 2050 on the same amount of land, or maybe less because of degraded lands and other pressures on our climate because of weather? And so those are the issues that have really, really kind of changed the way we're thinking. And then there's also the opportunity that comes with agriculture, a renewable resource, a resource that actually takes care of the land and sequesters carbon. How do we utilize every element of a plant or an animal in order to renew it or in order to use it for a whole host of areas? And so it's a concept called the bioeconomy, and it's using every element of a plant or an animal in order to have a good. And it's really, the future is, how do we shift from a fossil fuels-based economy that has really created a lot of the concerns that the world has about climate change into one that's renewable and is a bio-based economy. And so we're really focusing on improving that. And I think we're just at the beginning of that. You've seen what's happened with ethanol and with other elements of the bioeconomy, but it's really starting to transition and move in a way that is quite exciting for agriculture. So all of that combined is kind of what we're focusing on these days. And from my perspective, agriculture is a very exciting field to be a part of.
I agree. And you've highlighted one very important, I think, opportunity there for the sector. Are there any other opportunities for the industry across the Americas or globally, in your view?
Well, I think the life sciences sector is really exciting. With gene editing, with that new development within the biotechnology sphere, which is all part of the bioeconomy, we're going to be able to do things that we've never been able to do in the modification of plants and animals for human consumption, or for other purposes like the change and the shift from a fossil fuel economy into a bioeconomy. I think we're just at the beginning of that. We are going to be able to do so much with life sciences. And then you combine that life sciences with artificial intelligence, with informatics, with the progress of digital agriculture. All of that combined is going to have an incredible effect on how we're able to grow food, not just for human consumption, but also for a whole variety of purposes.
You work with a number of different governments across the Americas. How is this new technology and innovation being viewed? Is it being widely accepted now for the potential that it holds to address some of the challenges that we're facing, both with respect to climate change and increasing food insecurity globally? Or do we still have some work to do?
We have some work to do. We're progressing. There were countries in the Americas, in the region, that were very much opposed to biotechnology because they were opposed to transgenics. Many of those same countries are starting to embrace gene editing, which is essentially just editing within one plant, not taking one plant or species and moving it into another. They're embracing that. They're following the the norms that have been laid out by the Americas at a meeting we had in Cali. I think it was in 2019 in Cali, Colombia, in which we brought all the public officials, not ministers of agriculture. There were some undersecretaries and vice ministers, but we brought the professionals together to look at gene editing and how do we regulate this in a way that embraces and enables this technology to be accepted in these countries that heretofore had not accepted biotechnology. And they're starting to do it. And that's really exciting because that means that the Americas is embracing science and we're embracing change. And that change is going to help us solve the problems of the future.
Agreed. Great. I'm thrilled to hear that. Some sense of optimism for the future because that's an important innovation. So let's get political here for a moment. It's hard not to, given that the US is going to be holding an election this fall and Canada is not too far behind you. You've talked a little bit already about sustainability, climate change, the sector's response to related policies. What impact do you think that a change of government, if there is one in the US and Trump becomes the next president and the Conservatives form the next government here in Canada, what impact is that going to have on the sector's response to climate change in your view?
Well, elections always have consequences, but in the world of agriculture, I think there's a lot of bipartisan or multi-partisan consensus that we all need to eat. We all need to improve our agricultural system. We all need to find ways to embrace science and to embrace technology in order to achieve our national security and food security goals, as well as share that with the rest of the world. We have a good history of working with the Trump administration when they were here 4 years ago. And we didn't see a big shift between Obama to Trump to Biden because it's a bipartisan issue. Food security is a bipartisan issue. It's a national security issue for every country. And so we find a lot of consensus and uniformity around support for agriculture. There's different ways in each kind of administration, whether it's Republican or Democrat or whatever, in all the different countries that we work with. But usually there's going to be a support for the system, a support for the farmers, and that sometimes differs. Some people are more pro environment or more pro productivity or small farmer or large farmer. But at the end of the day, they need to support for their own national security and food security, the agricultural sector. And so we are always confident that whatever new administration comes into whatever country, we're going to be able to find ways to work with them in order to achieve their national interests.
So let's talk, let's focus the conversation perhaps a little more broadly and talk about what IICA's role is in the global context beyond the Americas. Can you speak to that? Perhaps the role that the organization plays when it comes to informing or influencing the global discourse?
Sure. I will maybe touch on the three elements that the Director General uses as pillars for IICA. First is that we're an institution of open doors, so everyone's welcome and that we are as transparent as possible. Second is that we're a bridge to the rest of the world, meaning we work with all of our ministers of agriculture and represent them and go with them to international standard setting bodies. And then the third element is that we are an institute that brings consensus, a consensus from the Americas to share with the rest of the world on food and agriculture. So we are a reference body and observer to all the major food and ag international standard setting bodies. So Codex Alimentarius, the Cartagena Protocol, the WTO, the WTO SPS Committee, the OIE, which is now called WOA, and they'll probably be called the OIE in a couple more years because they seem to always change their name, the IPPC. So we go with our member states. We build capacity with within our member states so that we have a consensus or an agreement among the Americas. So we arrive at these institutions as the Americas. Sometimes we're not. Sometimes there's difference. But I was really pleased. I'll share a story with you that one of my first Codex meetings on behalf of the IICA, being a former U.S. official and then going to Rome for a Codex meeting, I was just thrilled to see different member states within our country. I won't mention the member states, but two of the Latin member states were kind of fighting about how to make science even more elevated and more important in their discussions with Codex too, in the debate for the Codex policies. I told the Canadian representative, and I don't know whether he was from Ag Canada or Health Canada, that this is magnificent to see this consensus about the Americas embracing science. And he said, "Shh, don't tell anyone. We don't want to jinx this process because it's really worked." And so we're really quite thrilled that we've been able to build consensus around the elements of agriculture and to move from codex to talk about, what's been driving agriculture for the past several years in this administration. It really all started with the movement for a food system summit that was held by the United Nations in 2000, I believe it was 22. But back in 2019, the whole world came to IICA from a bunch of different organizations to talk about food system transformation, but there were no farmers at that meeting. There were no food companies. There were no ministers of agriculture. And so that drove this institute, our director general, to say, look, in any kind of international forum talking about food systems, farmers must be represented, and they must be supported. The second is that science, not political science, not ideology, science needs to be the foundation for any kind of public policy. And the third is that agriculture needs to be viewed as a solution to our climate challenges, not as just a problem, not as just an emitter, because there are amazing things that are happening now with life sciences, with new ways of growing, with regenerative ag, with no-till ag, with all the new innovations that are coming to the fore on helping reduce methane in livestock and other things. We are going to be able to address a lot of the challenges and the emissions of agriculture through science, through technology, through innovation, through human beings modifying the content of their food. And so we're pretty excited about that stuff. And the UN Food System Summit, and actually things like this, Zoom, during a time of COVID, helped us reach out and connect with our ministers of agriculture in a way that we were able to work with them to first make sure that agriculture was viewed as essential during a time of crisis and pandemic. And the second is that we all united from Canada to Argentina once again to go to this food system summit and to say, this is the view from the Americas. And it was a view that embraced those three elements. And then we've taken that on to other international organizations such as the COP in Dubai last year, and before that in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt, so that agriculture is viewed as not, the bad guy in these sessions, which they were viewed as before, but we're a participant and we're part of the solution, and we're doing our best to improve the way we produce so that we can both feed the planet, but we can also take care of it.
Does the food system need to be transformed in your view?
Well, we don't believe, as many do, that the food system is broken. We believe that the food system is an absolute miracle. I mean, you think about 100 years ago, there were three huge innovations that changed agriculture: hybrid corn, fertilizers, and the tractors. And that transformed agriculture, especially in North America, from subsistence agriculture into productive agriculture. Then came the Green Revolution with Norman Borlaug at Chapingo in Mexico, and his work on stem rust in wheat. And that caused the creation of a CGIAR system that focused on productivity. So we've been able to solve a lot of the problems of feeding the world. Now the challenge is going to be to continue trying to feed the world, but also try to do it in a way in which we mitigate our impact on the environment. And I think we can do it. We've done it before. It's not, it doesn't need transformation as much as it needs improvement. And so that's how we're kind of challenging that notion of the narrative that the food system is broken. We don't believe the food system is broken. We believe it's an absolute miracle, and it's a miracle because of the hard work by our farmers and ranchers, but also the hard work of scientists around the world.
I appreciate that perspective. And in doing this work in the international space, do we have any natural allies?
Natural allies in terms of,
other countries or jurisdictions that you're working with in some of these international forums, like-minded countries?
There's a lot of like-minded countries, and we're starting to work with other regions of the world that need to that need to do the same thing that we're doing. In fact, you're going to hear something in the very near future about some work that we're doing between Latin America and Africa, because Africa is going to be the source of global population growth. And we feel that if we can work more with that huge and important continent on their own productivity and learning from them and them maybe learning from us, we think we can solve a lot of the problems of food productivity and feeding those populations there. So we're going to start working harder with them. Asia, of course, is very important. It's a huge part of the world, and we're starting. Last year, we had some outreach to that part of the world, and then we think that there's a lot of concern often about some of the European regulations, but European farmers, when you talk to them, they talk just like us. They want the same things and they want access to the same technologies and science. They just, are going through some challenges right now over there, but hopefully they'll be able to become important allies of ours as well and maybe transform some of their policies and politics that will be more open to some of the innovations that are being created there as well as created here.
I think a lot of our listeners would be shocked to hear that you think there's potential that the EU could ever be an ally on some of these issues. But let's talk about the EU for a moment then, shall we? Because they can't be ignored. They're a significant market for many of our commodities. And I think even more relevant to this conversation would be the level of influence that they've had in some of these international and multilateral forums. So let's talk about some of those policies. And we can't avoid the elephant in the room, the farm to fork strategy. Is it dead?
Well, I think in terms of the legislation there, for the moment, it is dead. I think when I'm talking about allies, I'm talking about farmers in Europe, not necessarily the government. But the government responds to the influences of its constituents, and I think are making it very clear how they feel about some of the policies that were in the farm to fork that may not be exactly what those farmers need in order to feed their own domestic population, nor what the world needs. And so we're hopeful that with dialogue with the European Union, that's an important partner of ours as well, because they support a lot of the projects that happen in the Caribbean and in developing parts of Latin America, particularly here in Central America. So they're an important partner as well. And if we can, have discussions with them and with their farmers to hopefully modify some of those policies that are detrimental to our ability to enable the use of tools from crop protection to seeds to life sciences in order to produce food in a more efficient way here, hopefully we'll be able to achieve and bridge some gaps in understanding between this part of the world and that part of the world. And I think it's possible. Talking to European farmers last year up in Canada at the event in Prince Edward Island, they agreed with our position on everything from biotechnology to crop protection. So I think, it's getting sometimes the political class to speak to its productive sector in order to make sure that their policies are more aligned with helping them achieve their goals and achieve the actual goals of their citizens.
Yeah, you and I were both at that conference in PEI last summer, and that was the first time. I'm sure you've had other opportunities, and so I'd be curious to know if you think the conversation has evolved. But that was the first time I've ever been at a conference where you had farmers from Mexico, the US, Canada, and Europe, and they were all aligned, which is something I didn't necessarily expect. Has that always been the case, or has there been an evolution in your view in terms of their understanding and appreciation for some of these policies? What's your experience with that?
I think to some extent, all farmers have some alignment. They're the people who work on the soil. We got the whole world telling them what to do with soil, regenerative ag, etc. These guys have been working on their soil for generations and generations, and there's a lot of traditional practices and knowledge that they all have. And so I think any farmer is going to have a certain connection to another farmer, even though they're from different parts of the world. Often it becomes an area of conflict when we talk about trade. And don't necessarily want competition from other parts of the world that are going to impact their bottom line. But I think the farm lobby in general, in most parts of the world, sees benefits to trade. They see benefits to their income. They see benefits to the opportunity to sell their Canadian grain or their Mexican avocados or their wine from Chile to the rest of the world. And so I think there's a common goal. Sometimes when we get mired in disputes among neighbors or about trading partners, we forget what that common goal is. But at the end of the day, trade has benefited agriculture tremendously, probably more than any other sector. And so I think we just need to work on education as well as on trying to find consensus among farmers rather than opposition.
Back to the EU for just a moment. I have a final question because I'm curious to know your thoughts both on, look, they're also facing an election this spring. And, you look at some of the recent changes with respect to farm to fork, which to your point were informed by farmer protests. Do you think that is going to change the way in which European policymakers show up in many of these international forums? With it, expecting that there's likely going to be a shift within the government this spring, but I think also with respect to their position on agri-environmental policies and the changes within farm to fork. Is it going to shift their willingness to want to drive this agenda in the international forum? Is it going to have any impact on their credibility in your view?
I don't know. We'll have to see what happens with the elections and what happens with any kind of policy changes that occur there. I think one of the things that when I look at some of the farm to fork policies, the goals are good, but they're just not based on what farmers actually need in order. And some of those goals have unintended consequences. For instance, if you take technology away from farmers' hands, well, they're going to produce less. That means that they're going to have to use more land to produce and more inputs to produce. So it's exactly the opposite of what they want. So I think it's really an education process for a lot of policymakers that aren't necessarily informed about agriculture and informed about science and technology and the tools that farmers need. And I think that this process and this election and maybe what happened with the farm to fork will help inform policymakers there that they need to maybe sit down at the table with their farmers and then with their trading partners and their farmers overseas as well to figure out how we can all work together to achieve the same goals of feeding a growing population and trying to have a reduced impact on planet Earth in that sector as well as many other sectors. So I wouldn't say I'm optimistic, but I would say I'm cautiously optimistic that we might be able to see some changes to, no matter what happens in the elections. I think the farmers speaking up so loudly and so unanimously in all the different countries, not just in Europe, but around the world, I think is an important wake call to politicians who sometimes, the amount of people, especially in developed countries like in Europe and Canada and the United States, the amount of people involved in agriculture is really small. So it's really important sometimes that the farmers have to voice their opinions, and sometimes they have to do it in ways that they don't want to do it. But that maybe wakes up some people to say, we need to look at the situation in a very serious way. And maybe instead of having these lofty goals, which may not be based on reality, let's study this a little bit more and bring in some other folks into this debate, because politics are always informed by the various pressures that come from different organized groups. Maybe they need to talk to the organized group of farmers and constituents that before they make the next policy. And I think they're going to do that.
I hope so. And that would apply to all jurisdictions here in Canada too. Imagine that, consulting with farmers in advance of those policy developments. Always an important thing to do. I'm going to close this portion of our conversation. I have a personal interest in leadership, Lloyd, having studied the topic as part of my graduate degree. And I think that increasingly these unprecedented challenges that we're facing require unprecedented leadership. So I want to close all of my conversations by asking my guests to weigh in on the topic. And my question to you is this. You talked a lot about consensus. The organization that you lead is charged with bringing together a fairly diverse group of stakeholders in an effort to advance the agriculture sector's shared interests. What are one or two things that you've learned as a leader, be it skills, attributes, or the various approaches that you've taken, that have served you well when faced with important issues that you know would really benefit from a common or united approach or position, and consensus feels like it's out of reach? And as someone who has spent a better part of her career leading industry associations, I'm all ears.
Well, thanks. That's a tough question, Erin. I think the most important thing for any leader is to listen to people first. Most people that get to your level of leadership in an organization or in an institute like this. They have a pretty set ways of thinking and they know what they want to do. But when you work for 34 member states, you need to listen to those member states and you need to listen to their farmers. And they're farmers of all sizes, not just the big farmers and the successful farmers, but you have to listen to the farmers that are a little more humble. This week, we just ended a session which was called the Leaders of the Souls of Rurality. It's a hard word to say in English and in Spanish, but we had 40 leaders here that weren't, the Canadian Grains Council, but they were maybe a small farmers of quinoa from the highlands of Bolivia or Peru or some dairy farmers in Chile or coffee farmers in Guatemala, just a whole mix of farmer leaders, but not, the ones that end up going in front of their ministers of agriculture, but just the ones who lead their communities and often very poor and impoverished parts of rurality in the Americas that don't have a voice. And we, through our offices, have been on a campaign to kind of promote these people and to promote their contribution to the world of agriculture. So we had a whole week with them here, and it was really interesting to listen to them, to listen to a perspective that's different than listening to the Canadian Farm Federation or the U.S. Farm Bureau or the European, farm leadership. It was really kind of down to earth. And so it makes us think about how do we work with ministers of agriculture to ensure that those people who don't have the financing, they don't have necessarily the modern skills, but they have a lot of ancestral and just know-how that a lot of modern folks don't have. How do we ensure that those voices are listened to, and how do the policies that we try to shape with our ministers and our programs help them and achieve their goals as well as the goals of broader nation or a broader region? And so I think listening is the most important part of is a first step for any kind of leader. And the second is to have once you have some kind of vision, once you listen, you need to promote what you're going to do and you need to act. And so our director general has those three, just like with our three themes for the Food System Summit. He has listen, promote, and act as some of the three elements of how we act here at IICA, because listening to people is great, but if you're not going to do anything about it, if you're not going to develop the policies to do something and then act on them, you're really not doing what you need to do. And so that's what we've been trying to do here at IICA. And part of what we try to do is to reach out to folks like you at the Canadian Grains Council, as well as with your partners across Canada and across the Americas and really around the world, is to make sure that we're hearing the voice of the agricultural sector, and so that we can help our ministers in their jobs, because it's not an easy job. And ministers come and go pretty fast when there's farmer protests. So we try to help them achieve their goals with their constituents as well as around the world.
So would you say that your organization also serves as an important conduit? Because you're out there talking directly to the grassroots. You're having conversations directly with ministers. Do you serve as a conduit as well to inform the discussions between the two parties?
Oh, between the two parties, not necessarily, because every minister has connections with his own constituents. We're more of a bridge for those ministers to other parts of the region, other parts of the world, as well as to the international standard-setting bodies that have to work with all of them and all of us. And hopefully we can have a unified voice when we go to those in order to promote the vision and the perspectives and the consensus that comes from the Americas.
Thank you very much for this, Lloyd. Listen, promote, act. I like that. It's clear, it's simple, it's effective. I think often it's the listening we forget to do, but I know from my experience, we often end up in a much better place, although it may take us a little longer to get there if we reflect on everyone's different perspectives on that particular issue and take some time to address those concerns. This has been a fantastic conversation. I look forward to continuing the conversation with you in a week and a half when you're back in Canada.
I look forward to seeing you.
Excellent. Safe travels.
Thank you very much.
I hope you found this episode as thought-provoking and inspiring as I did. Remember, these Fireside Chats with Erin are monthly, so mark your calendars. We'll be back in May with another great conversation. Stay connected with us for more engaging conversations that delve into the heart of the grain industry. You can catch us on your favorite podcast platforms, including Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. Just search for Fireside Chats with Erin, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Until next time.